What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and with a new season comes a new opportunity for baseless and probably incorrect speculation as we talk about a 40k faction tier list for the Pariah Nexus season. As we are still new to the Pariah Nexus format, I am looking at recent event data to inform my tier list here, but I'm also going to be tempering that with my own observations. And as always, it's important to keep in mind with these faction tier lists that the armies at the lower ends of the spectrum I'm in no way saying are incapable of winning events. We are seeing right now that while Pariah Nexus, it looks like, has compressed the power level of the game a little bit towards the lower end, there are a couple factions that are doing incredibly well and are sort of skewing towards the higher tiers. We still see event wins, especially at the smaller tables, but also at 5+ round GTs from essentially every faction in the game. It's still the case in 10th edition that luck and player skill has more to do with winning than your faction selection. If you know your army in and out and you know the matchup, then you are probably advantaged over someone who is new to it. If you're watching this at the time of release, I'm probably actively on my way traveling to the ATC, the largest team tournament in the US, in order to cover it. That will be live on my channel from Friday, July 12th through Sunday, July 14th. Please come hang out with me for that coverage. It's gonna be amazing, and I'm psyched, and I'll see you there. So with that, let's dive into this tier list, starting with Space Wolves. Now, I think Space Wolves are actually doing fairly well currently in terms of their win percentage. I don't know if that will hold true. I'm going to put them somewhere in the middle of the pack right now. Space Marines proper did get pretty seriously nerfed, but Space Wolves did see some updates, and we are already seeing Champions of Rust, their bespoke detachment, doing fairly well with the new changes that it got in the balanced data slate. I'm curious to see whether this continues on into the future, since I do think that the negative changes that Space Wolves got dramatically outweigh the buffs that the faction received. They saw a lot of changes to their normal builds for Stormlance, as well as their access to a lot of unique unit types. Things like Apothecaries no longer being playable in Space Wolves armies is a big change and will force many Space Wolf players, especially playing armies like Gladius Task Force, unless they're relying on their own fire discipline applicators to move to a standard Space Marine archetype rather than sticking in Space Wolves and then losing access to all the Space Wolf special units. That is unfortunate for them, but I think generally speaking, they are going to be doing fairly well since the unique abilities they have are still pretty strong. Genestealer Cult is the next one. I think we're going to put these guys towards the bottom of the pack here in the low tier. Unfortunately, the Genestealer Cult Codex isn't really helping these guys out, and while I do think that there are some playable archetypes inside the Codex, and you can certainly do well with them, you're definitely fighting uphill with this faction, and here's hoping for some big updates to their Codex when we see the next balanced data slate around. Now, speaking of updates to a faction, next up is going to be Adeptus Mechanicus. I'm going to put these guys here in C tier. I do think Adeptus Mechanicus, they were incredibly underpowered pre to the update. They're doing better, but I don't know if it has necessarily fixed the faction's problems. The update changed a lot of their core mechanics and gives them a lot more playable archetypes. They have a lot more interesting army lists that they can mess around with, but they are still relatively one-dimensional. The faction relies primarily on ranged attacks, which is not something that the Pariah Nexus system is conducive to. It has huge bonuses for melee armies, especially with the new map updates, and armies with lots of ranged attacks are struggling a little bit. Adeptus Mechanicus does have the benefit of being able to pivot into other playstyles, but it's not quite as effective as their ranged attacks, so I think we're going to put them down here in C tier, although, to be fair, I think there's still a lot of exploration to be done with the faction, and I definitely think that Adeptus Mechanicus could see a spike later on as we learn how to play with their new and improved mechanics. Next up is the flip side of the coin to these new factions. We got Adeptus Sororitas over here, and I think these are a pretty easy windmill slam up into the top of the game. Even after we saw some pretty hefty points changes to the points values that were in their updated codex, the core mechanics of that codex are ludicrously powerful. The data sheets inside are insanely synergistic. Each unit benefits the army in incredible ways. Most of the units in the army have extremely strong support effects and also have massive damage output, and the Miracle Dice mechanic is better now than it ever has been, with more ways to spend errant Miracle Dice, as well as ways to generate them, especially generating them with automatic high facings, like the Triumph of St. Catherine. While Bringers of the Flame is definitely the best attachment that Adeptus Sororitas have access to, they aren't locked into that. I do think that there are other builds in Army of Faith, in Penitent Host, and potentially even that are just as good as Sisters, that are much better in this new codex than Sisters were in the Index, which was already fairly strong. Next up, we have Tau Empire, and it might be controversial, but I am going to put Tau Empire over here in A tier. They definitely don't hold a handle to Adepta Sororitas, but the Montka detachment, I think, plays with how the Pariah Nexus mission format plays extremely well. Having a lot of forward operators, a lot of fast units, and the ability to alpha strike your opponent into the stratosphere is incredibly strong, because it sort of smooths your game plan out. One benefit that you have if you have a really good early game is the opportunity to, if you go second, play conservatively and play for secret missions, but if you go first, you can blitz the opponent and prevent them from ever getting to the point that they would complete those secret missions. This makes these very aggressive forward operation style armies very effective, and there's a couple other one of those that we're going to talk about later on for similar reasons. Tau have been killing it the last couple of weeks. We've seen a lot of Montka detachments that are super creative and bringing a wide variety of data sheets in the factions. We also see some Kauyons and Retaliation cadres that are also doing well, which has opened up a ton of build variety that Tau just simply didn't have access to in the last couple of weeks prior to the Pariah Nexus update. While there was a little bit of a lukewarm reception to their new codex, I think it's finally coming into its own, and Tau are looking fairly good moving on into the season. Now let's move on to Black Templars. I'm going to put Black Templars here down towards the bottom of the barrel. They are not doing so well right now, and while I do think that they do have some viable builds, they were also the recipients of some of the biggest nerfs to the Space Marine faction. They saw changes to Ironstorm Spearhead, which is really buoying Black Templars quite a bit. They also saw changes to the unit archetypes that they have access to. They can no longer take Librarians, for example, which was unfortunate. And while I do think that Black Templars are probably fine in a Gladius Task Force build, certainly at least of similar power level, if not a little bit more better off than a standards or vanilla Space Marine army in that detachment, the fact remains that they are still struggling a little bit, I think, since a lot of players sort of abandoned them for other sub-factions after their Ironstorm Spearhead builds were nerfed. The same cannot be said of Blood Angels, however. Blood Angels are doing very well and are still incredibly popular, and we're going to put them here down to a lower level than Adeptus Sororitas, but still sort of at the top of the metagame. They have an incredibly high win rate, and as I mentioned before, Pariah Nexus is slanted pretty heavily, in my opinion, towards melee armies, and especially fast melee armies that can clear the gaps between their terrain features very quickly, and Blood Angels can do that. In my opinion, we're in a kind of a golden age for fast assault armies right now. The Pariah Nexus terrain sets give you a huge quantity of places to hide units in very relevant positions, and Blood Angels are perfectly suited to take advantage of that. They were already doing well. Their most popular archetypes basically saw no changes at all in the data slate update, which was shocking, and the format has become better for them, so I think that they are just going to be going from strength to strength. Astra Militarum is going to be up next. I'm going to put them sort of again in the middle of the pack here. I do think that they are struggling a little bit after the nerfs that they saw to their most common archetypes. And indirect fire getting nerfed again is just bad for Astra Militarum, but we have been seeing the faction rally a little bit around more aggressive kind of Lehman Russ style builds, which has definitely kept them relevant. So despite the fact that the Astra Militarum standard kind of mono build has been nerfed, the faction is still pivoting to other armies. They're taking super heavies, that are taking Lehman Russ, that are focusing on different units, even Tempestus Scion focus builds, which are ridiculously strong right now, with a newly discounted points value, and all of those are looking fairly good for the army. Next up, we've got Grey Knights. Grey Knights are an interesting one because they have been nerfed a little bit, and a lot of people, I think, have kind of abandoned them. I'm going to be putting them in B tier here as well. I do wonder if we will see them improve as the season goes on and as people kind of reacquaint themselves with Grey Knights, but the slight nerfs that they did receive, it seems like, have moved a lot of people off of the faction, and their win rate has suffered significantly as a result. Whether or not that continues moving on into the season, I don't know, and I would be curious to see what they look like in a couple of months, but right now they're struggling just a little bit, but not doing poorly in the grand scheme of the game. The same is basically going to be said for Eldar. We're going to put them right next to Grey Knights here in B tier. They have a lot of playable builds, and there is a little bit of discourse about how they may be a strong contender against the top factions in the game. The downside is that they are very expensive right now. It turns out almost a full year of being the undisputed masters of 40k ends up seeing you nerfed quite a bit. So their unit count is relatively low, and while I do think that they are pretty appropriate in the Pariah Nexus format, they did have a little bit of a focus on indirect fire, kind of like Astra Militarum, so they got hit a little bit by that nerf, although it wasn't the biggest deal because a lot of their stuff was hitting on 4s anyway, and they can sometimes struggle to take the model count that they need to compete with some of the higher tier factions. Next up, we have Deathwatch. These guys are mostly just kind of a sad story right now. We're going to put them at the bottom of the game. They do actually have a really high win win rate currently, but that is because their player count is abysmally low. And the players who are sticking with Deathwatch are Deathwatch specialists who are ridiculously skilled at playing the faction. Unfortunately for Deathwatch, they are struggling monumentally. They're really having a tough time, and they basically got nerfed indirectly because of the changes to the Space Marine Codex in its totality. And without any buffs at all, they were already extremely badly performing, really struggling in a lot of different arenas, and got nerfed without seeing any updates. That said, I don't know how long this is going to be relevant, because the rumor is, the scuttlebutt is, that they are going to be getting axed and rolled into an Agents of the Imperium Codex. So the mechanics for Deathwatch may look entirely different in a couple of weeks. We'll just have to see what comes out of that rumor. But if so, hopefully they get some updated rules and we do see them do a little bit better, because right now they are very, very bad, extremely bad. That is not the case. Wow, we are really roller coastering here. The whiplash from these factions and how the tier maker has decided to put them together is very funny. Drukhari is the next one, and interestingly, we are going to put them up here to S tier. They saw huge mechanical changes from the core rules updates in the June update. The Lord of Deceit change, buffing Archons, or at least the Warlord Archon, depending on how your event is ruling the interaction. Gaining Lord of Deceit is huge for the faction, because previously their Agents effect where they could CP tax a stratagem that was used while their Warlord was on the battlefield, if their Warlord was an Archon, was really convoluted. It was hard to use, and for a faction that relied entirely on transports, having to keep your characters on the table in order for their abilities to proc was really anti-synergistic. Now they are an aggressive transport army, which is already fairly good. They're close combat oriented, or at least close range oriented, which is also good in Pariah Nexus. That synergizes extremely well with the new Lord of Deceit mechanic and the new pivot roles, depending on how you're playing them. And I do have several videos talking about those new pivot roles. Have some huge consequences for armies that are based on physically large models that are they're on round bases, because it potentially gives them the ability to rotate and gain additional movement extremely effective. Again, I don't know how long that's gonna stick around, and I also don't know how transformative that is to the faction. I do think that the other changes and the format itself is very, very good for Drukhari, but I think that they are perfectly suited to play well in Pariah Nexus, and their mechanics just got improved from the June update, and the players who are playing them are absolutely killing it right now. Drukhari are tearing it up, more so than they have, I think, ever before in 10th edition. And that moves us on to Thousand Sons. Now we're going to put Thousand Sons down here in A tier. I definitely think that Thousand Sons are still extremely competitive, despite the changes that they saw in the June update. They did get pretty heavily debuffed, but they saw some very nice quality of life changes. And to be fair, I do think that Thousand Sons were kind of indirectly buffed more than they were nerfed. Things like Mass Indirect Fire was the real killer for the faction. Astra Militarum, Exorcist-based Adepta Sororitas, even Night Spinner-based Aeldari were just nightmares for these guys. And seeing debuffs to Indirect Fire is enormous to them. They can use Indirect Fire themselves by using Warp Sight, but their Indirect Fire is almost either not changed at all, because it's a torrent weapon, so it doesn't get affected by the change. And it also saw some improvements in some instances, because you can now use echoes from the warp to discount the CP value of that stratagem. It was previously 2 CP, now you can use echoes to discount it by 1, so it costs you 6 Cabal points and a CP, and that's all pretty nice to then be firing Indirect Fire flamers through buildings and people. Thousand Sons definitely survived the transition well. I do think that they maybe ended up a little bit worse for wear, but I don't think enough to sort of dramatically change their win rate, and the players who are doing well with them are going to continue to do well with them moving on into the future. Now, Chaos Demons also saw some huge balance changes and enormous qualities of life updates. We're going to put them kind of at the bottom of A tier here, I think. They're looking very strong, but I don't know if they're going to be quite as strong as these other factions in the top, like, third of the tier list so far. That said, the updates to their mechanics to allow their Greater Demons to project a Shadow of Chaos aura were enormously transformative. And as we've been seeing, they have made it so that upgraded and enhanced sort of character Greater Demons, things like Great Unclean Ones, Bloodthirsters, and Lords of Change, are able to operate more effectively around the table without having to worry about staying in proximity to Be'lakor, ensuring that their Shadow of Chaos gets locked in. They can simply operate independently and are as powerful as they were at their most powerful before the update. We also, and I think most interestingly, are seeing a little bit of a metagame change in this faction to play more infantry and lighter units, largely because that Shadow of Chaos projection now allows these greater demons to teleport down demons of their own allegiance and get really easy deep strikes with them. And that allows you to deliver things like Bloodletters, Plague Bearers, and these other smaller demon units that are high OC, pretty effective, and very good at flipping objectives and maintaining the tempo for the demon player, more so than greater demons could, way more easily than they could in the past. That's a huge quality of life change for demons, and that combined with some good changes to the terrain format to make it easier for these big melee-focused monsters to move around the table, plus not to mention, obviously, the movement changes, making it better for large kind of models with these huge outstretched wings to maneuver around the table, have all been hugely beneficial to the faction. That moves us on to Death Guard. We're going to put Death Guard somewhere around C tier here. I think they are definitely doing better than the Space Marine sub-factions, but they're definitely not the best thing ever. A little bit of a sad story. They kind of feel like they're forgotten a little bit. They didn't see too many changes in the update, and the indirect fire changes absolutely killed them. They had a lot of archetypes that were based around Plague Bruise Crawlers that are really not that playable anymore, which is too bad, but they still have a lot going for them. And we're seeing some like combined tank builds that are either focusing on heavy vehicles or character-centric infantry units that they can stack defensive buffs on, which is kind of true to the Death Guard nature, and are doing, I don't want to say extremely well, but they're doing okay. Death Guard are very mediocre right now, and unfortunately for the metagame, right now kind of the definition of mediocre has been pushed down a little bit because these factions at the top here are a little overrepresented currently. Now that moves us on to Space Marines proper. I'm going to put them at the bottom of C here. Again, Space Marines were already, this is classic Space Marines obviously, so we're talking about Codex compliant stuff like Ultramarines and Salamanders. They definitely have a lot of play styles that are still viable, but they got nerfed without really seeing any benefits, and they were already struggling. They basically got caught in the crossfire of the Codex compliant factions. Things like Black Templars with their Ironstorm Spearhead, things like Space Wolves with their Stormlance, all ended up nerfing the faction as a whole and didn't really see any improvements that were commensurate with those nerfs. So most of the time, if you were playing Space Marines competitively, you were focusing on the non-compliant chapters. The non-compliant chapters got nerfed, which also affects the compliant chapters, which are already doing worse than the compliant chapters, which is just driving them down and down and down. I still think that you can play them, and there's definitely some viable archetypes in there, like I mentioned before. I think Salamanders are still pretty strong. They did see some downgrades because of the Redeemer getting nerfed, but there is some interesting technology in the faction still. I do think that they need a little bit of help, however. Now, speaking of the exact opposite, let's talk about Tyranids. These guys saw a hugely transformative update in the balanced data slate. They were basically entirely rewritten from the ground up with huge changes to data sheets and their faction abilities, army abilities, all sorts of stuff changed for Tyranids. That said, I don't think it was quite as transformative as people were hoping. There's a lot of discourse about how strong Tyranids were going to be with those changes, and I think that they ended up just being kind of okay. They're still really reliant on combo assembly, and their combos being battle shock focused means that they are kind of inherently inconsistent. And while they now have damage output and a lot more consistency than they had in the past, that definitely hasn't skyrocketed them to the heights of competitive dominance. I think that they're somewhere in B tier, probably somewhere like this. I don't think that they're going to be blowing up the game anytime soon. They're definitely going to be more common than we saw them in the past, but they're definitely fallible. There's a lot of failure points inside their game plan. If you just roll your battle shocks well, a lot of Tyranid armies just fall apart. And while there is some exploration to do, assimilation swarms and Crusher Stampedes, for example, that are not necessarily battle shock focused, are potentially viable archetypes and don't require your opponent to roll bad leadership checks in order to beat them. Whether or not those are consistently high scoring detachments is going to remain to be seen. So far, I think Tyranids are basically smack dab in the center of the game right now. Now, a faction that is seeing some success after their changes is going to be Adeptus Custodes. We're going to put them over here in A tier. They're doing very well right now for themselves. They've already gotten a couple event wins under their belts, and their win rate is fairly high currently. The changes that they saw to Auric Champions and to Shield Host made those detachments deal way more damage. The changes that we saw to Devastating Wounds makes anti-mortal wound protection that the Custodes faction has in spades way better against Devastating Wound factions like Thousand Suns, and they also saw some points cuts on top of that, which make units like Venatari extremely efficient and able to be played in large numbers. And these styles of archetypes where Custodes are able to just chuck a ton of these jump pack or teleporting Custodian Guard onto their opponent's side of the table and tell them to deal with it while backing that up with solid shooting is pretty effective and has been doing fairly well for the Custodians in the last couple weeks. Next up, we'll talk about Necrons. I think Necrons are another faction that's kind of okay. They definitely were up here with Grey Knights in the Leviathan season, at least the last season, faction after the latest update, kind of in the top tier here, and they both saw some nerfs. I think Necrons got the harder hits of the nerfs than Grey Knights did for sure, but they were already kind of in a precarious spot. Necrons were largely reliant almost entirely on their Canoptek court, and they saw some additional nerfs to that detachment, changes to the Canoptek units themselves, changes to stratagems like their lone operative stratagem to make it less effective, and that's definitely hurt the faction as a whole. Now, there are some Hypercrypt Legion lists that are doing fairly well, and we may see Necrons kind of reclaim that lost glory as we move on further into the season, but right now, without the ability to kind of crutch on that Canoptek court build, they are struggling a little bit, and their win rate has taken a little bit of a hit in the last couple of weeks. I also think that there's maybe a little bit of a meta game concern with the factions at the top here, which tend to be pretty good at killing the styles of units that Necrons are bringing. Necrons oftentimes rely on these tanky, kind of feel no pain, invulnerable save based models like C'tan Shards and Canoptek Wraiths, and armies like Blood Angels and Adepta Sororitas and even Thousand Suns are incredibly good at killing those styles of models. So the armies at the top here are pretty well suited to kill Necrons, and Necrons are getting nerfed on top of that. So they're struggling a little bit. I don't think that they're like sort of non-viable by any stretch of the imagination. They've just kind of moved to somewhere around the middle of the game, but they're certainly worse than they were last season. Next up is going to be Dark Angels. These guys, I think, are a little bit of an unknown quantity, at least for me right now. They did see some huge buffs to their faction-specific detachments. Whether or not those are good enough to, like Space Wolves, shift the focus of the faction to playing those detachments rather than classic Space Marine detachments is an open question. But right now, that hasn't really been represented. They haven't been doing super well, but I don't think many people have picked up those new detachments. We'll see if taking Mass Terminators or Unforgiven Task Forces or something is competitively viable as we move on to the future. Right now, they are another faction that just sort of got caught in the crossfire of these other non-compliant Space Marine chapters getting nerfed, and them getting nerfed themselves as well, with some points changes to core Space Marine units. They did see some updates to the Dark Angels units proper, which I think will push them way higher into playability, and I think with some of the changes to things like Heroic Intervention, you can see some units like Lionel Johnson taken in Dark Angels armies again, and you won't feel too bad about that because the Fights First ability is in very high demand right now, but we'll just have to see if that ends up being viable in the long term. Next up is Orks. I think a lot of people sort of abandoned Orks for other aggressive factions. I saw a lot of Orc players actually moving to Adeptus Sororitas and to Blood Angels recently because they are sort of a similar archetype, but much more viable. Unfortunately, Orc Bully Boys was really kind of carrying the faction previously, and they just got hammered in a bunch of different ways. It's still probably one of the strongest detachments in the faction, but they also have some other good ones. Warhorde is fairly good, and Dreadmob wants to be good, but I think largely still struggles. So unfortunately, Orks right now are struggling a little bit. Getting the brunt of nerfs in the latest update was really not what the faction needed when they already only had one or two detachments that they were focusing on. Orks right now are sitting somewhere around the bottom of the pack in terms of their win rate, and we're going to keep them somewhere in here down in C tier alongside the Space Marine factions based on those changes. Next up is Chaos Space Marines. We're really kind of filling up our C tier here. Chaos Space Marines is another faction that got hit pretty hard, and they are seeing some success. Chaos Space Marines typically come out around the top of the pack at a lot of GTs, but they aren't doing it consistently, and it seems like they only have a couple of viable builds. We see a couple Pact-bound Zealots as well as some Renegade Raiders doing well. Soulforge Warpack is another detachment that has a lot of viability, but for whatever reason, we just aren't seeing it quite as commonly as we are those other detachments. However, it hasn't really gotten the faction to a high, consistent win rate. They're still kind of struggling a little bit. We're going to put them down here around Adeptus Mechanicus. I definitely think the Chaos Space Marines could have what it takes. They have enough viable detachments to kind of reclaim their title moving on into the future, but they are fighting an uphill battle right now since a lot of their archetypes were nerfed, and they're feeling very inefficient currently with their most recent changes. Next up, we've got both Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights. I'm going to sort of glue these guys together because they are actually kind of just standing next to each other in terms of sort of viability. Both of them got changes to the super heavy walker keyword, which made those big heavy walkers really good. I'll just come out and say pretty strong. Chaos Knights is going to be somewhere around here in B tier, and they're actually both going to be sort of standing next to each other. I'm going to put Imperial Knights ahead a little bit, but I think for the most part, these are kind of at the same level. Imperial Knights got access to, or I don't want to say get access to, but they got a vastly improved version of Canis Rex, who is being played not only in Imperial Knights themselves, but also just in like every Imperial sub-faction right now. He's ridiculously strong, and the ability to move through walls from these guys means that they're very maneuverable and they're very defensive in the early game. It's very difficult to get a bead on Imperial Knights before they want want you to, because they can now stay out of terrain without being forced to awkwardly maneuver around it. With the ability to move through large ruins, these big walkers can play a much more defensive game plan than they saw in the past, and with Pariah Nexus's ability to recuperate any losses that they had on the primary objective in the late game with secret missions, these big walkers can actually come back and complete things like Unbroken Wall fairly effectively in the late game. Chaos Knights were already seeing some success in the Leviathan season using War Dogs, and I think those War Dog armies are still incredibly good, but now you can take a little bit more of a multi-threat army by incorporating super heavy walkers into those previous just high model count War Dog builds that were focused on tons of carnivores or tons of brigands. Now you can take things like Lancers or Rampagers inside that detachment and diversify the kinds of profiles that you are strong against. If somebody had a mass answer to toughness 10 vehicles, they could knock out the War Dog style lists pretty quickly, but there are many fewer lists that have answers to not only all of the War Dogs, but also a big super heavy walker that's running up the table with Veil of Medrengard and being very difficult to kill. Next up is going to be World Eaters, and kind of like I mentioned with Tau, World Eaters are another sort of forward operation, very aggressive style of build that I do think is fairly effective in Pariah Nexus. You can have the ability to, if you go first, put pressure on your opponent to prevent them from being able to sort of survive into the late game and complete secret missions. But if you go second, you have the maneuverability to play cagey and try to unlock that for yourself. So I think World Eaters they're doing okay right now. I'm not going to say that they're blowing up the whole game, but they're doing all right. We're going to put them at the top of B tier here for that ability to play aggressively, and as well as changes in the Pariah Nexus terrain formats that are conducive to this aggressive melee play. These guys can stage themselves in a lot of different positions moving up the battlefield to get units like to get fast units like 8-bound stuck into your opponent. The changes to movement and pivoting affect Angron quite a bit. He's actually much easier to move around the table now that he can rotate his big wings in order to fit into tight spaces more easily, and the ability for based measuring models to move through terrain that their physical model couldn't fit, as long as they can fit their base, does make him easier to move up the table. These are all beneficial changes to World Eaters, and I think they're going to be doing pretty okay moving on into the future. Similar to the last one we have here, Leagues of Votann. These guys, we're going to put them in A tier here, basically for the same reasons that we've got Tau doing fairly well. They have a kind of similar game plan. They want to push really aggressively up the table with their forward operators and sort of alpha strike their opponent into oblivion, and they're very good at doing that right now. Not to mention the fact that Votann got a new unit. They got the Hernkin Jaegers, which are kind of a transformative change to how the army plays. Those Jaegers can deploy aggressively in the center of the table and prevent enemy infiltrators from stopping the Votann scouts from moving up and pinning an opposing army into their deployment zone, or just moving up and sort of securing the center of the table so that Votann can sort of dominate it as the game moves forward. That was an enormous change to the faction. It was a perfect addition to the army's game plan, which was already very forward operation based, but they had no infiltrators innately. A similar thing kind of happened to Adepta Sororitas too. They got infiltration on their sister novitiates, and that is now a unit that, combined with Dominion squads, basically a combination that's seen in every single sisters list. You can use the novitiates to screen out the center of the table for your deployment phase, then put immolators or rhinos with dominions embarked inside them right behind those novitiates and use their scout move to alpha strike your opponent. Obviously Tau have access to the same thing, and these are all factions that are doing fairly well. So the introduction of that unit is huge for Votann, and we are already seeing it represented in their win rate, which is improving as the format develops. And with that, that is my perspective tier list for the Pariah Nexus season. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this one, if you disagree with any of my selections here, and how you think this tier list may change as players get more used to Pariah Nexus and playing in this format. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers, all you people are amazing. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.